The station smelled like rust and old fear. Sergeant Elias Cade moved through the dark corridor without a sound. His boots hit the metal floor in a rhythm so practiced it had become part of him, like breathing, like the weight of the rifle on his back, like the emptiness he carried everywhere and never talked about. The mission was simple. Get in, find the data node, get out. That was all Command had said. That was all he had asked. He had stopped asking for more than that a long time ago. The Keth station was enormous. Warlord Greth Saul had built it the way powerful men build everything, bigger than it needed to be, to make sure everyone knew. The corridors went on and on. The lights were dim and yellow. Cade moved through it all like a shadow with a job to do. He passed doors he did not open. He passed rooms with sounds he did not investigate. That was not the mission. He told himself that the way a man tells himself the stove is off when he already left the house. The deeper parts of the station were quieter. That was where the warlord kept his trophies. That was the word the intelligence report had used. Trophies. Cade had read it and moved on, the same way he moved on from most things. He moved on from most things very well. The trophy hall was long. Glass panels lined the walls on both sides, floor to ceiling, each one lit from inside with that same yellow light. Inside each panel was something alive, or something that had been alive, in the full way, before ending up here. Cade did not look at them directly. He kept his eyes forward. He kept moving. The data node was at the far end. He could see the terminal from here. 40 more steps. 35. He looked at the panels anyway. He was not sure when he started. One moment his eyes were forward. The next they were drifting, pulled by some part of him that hadn't learned yet to stop caring. The species were ranked by rarity. That much was clear. The rarest ones were at the far end, closest to the terminal, behind thicker glass. Some of them paced. Some of them sat with their backs to the light. One of them pressed both hands to the glass and watched him pass with eyes that asked nothing because they had given up asking. Cade kept walking. 20 steps, 15. He found the data node. He pulled the drive from his vest. His hands did the work, while the rest of him stayed very still inside his own head, the way soldiers learn to go still when the world gets too loud. The drive clicked in. Data began to transfer. 45 seconds. He waited. That was when he saw the cell. It was smaller than the others. Set apart from the main row, tucked into an alcove to his left, like an afterthought, or like something the warlord didn't want displayed too openly. The sigil above the door was one Cade recognized from treaty documents, from the briefing files he read on transport ships when he couldn't sleep. The Vari throne. He knew that sigil. Humanity had a non-aggression treaty with the Vari, had held it for 11 years. The treaty was one of the few things in the diplomatic record that both sides actually meant. He stepped toward the alcove. The glass was thick here, and the light inside was lower than the others. It took his eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, he saw her. She was sitting against the back wall, with her knees pulled to her chest. She was small, young. Her skin was a deep gray blue and faintly luminous, the way her species' skin always was, though the light in her was dim, more like an ember than a flame. She had been here long enough for the light to go dim. She did not move when she saw him. She did not scream, or stand, or press her hands to the glass. She just looked at him. That look. He had seen it in field hospitals, on the faces of people who had been hurt so many times that surprise had become too expensive to feel. People who had learned that hope was a thing that cost you every time it didn't work out, and so they had stopped buying it. She looked like she had stopped buying it a long time ago. The data drive beeped once in his vest. Transfer complete. 45 seconds. He was on schedule. He had the data. The mission was done. He needed to go back the way he came, Get to the extraction point. Get off the station. He stood in front of the alcove and did not move. The girl watched him. Her skin flickered once, a very small thing like a candle in wind, and then went still again. He thought about the mission brief. He thought about command. He thought about the extraction window, which was closing. He thought about the squad he used to have, and the way he had been volunteering for bad assignments ever since, and the way no one in command had questioned it, because some soldiers reach a point where they stop needing to be protected from the dangerous jobs. He had reached that point 2 years ago. He pulled the drive from the terminal and put it in his pocket. Then he looked at the cell door. It had a panel lock, 6 digits, Keth standard. He had cracked Keth standard locks 4 times on this mission already. His fingers moved before he finished deciding to move them. The door hissed open. The girl did not run. She pressed tighter against the back wall instead, which told him everything about what the door's opening had meant for her up until now. He stayed in the doorway. He did not step inside. He did not reach for her. He waited. 1 second. 2. She looked at the open door. Her skin flickered again. That small candle in wind movement. He said the only word that made sense. Run. He stepped back. He turned and started moving. Back toward the main corridor, back toward the exit route. He moved at a pace she could match, if she chose to. He did not look back to see if she was following. After 3 steps, he heard her feet hit the floor behind him. Small, quiet, quick. He let himself breathe. They made it 12 corridors before the alarms went off. The sound was enormous, deep and repeating, filling the whole station with red light and noise. Cade did not slow down. He adjusted his route by memory, cutting toward the maintenance levels where the alarm response teams wouldn't reach first. The girl stayed with him. He could hear her breathing, fast but controlled. She had been through enough that even alarms were just a new version of something old. That was a terrible thing to be able to tell about someone her age. He found the maintenance shaft. He pulled the grate. He went in first, then looked back. She was right there, watching him with those eyes that didn't ask anything anymore. He jerked his head toward the shaft. She climbed in. He pulled the grate closed behind them, and they moved into the dark, and the alarms kept screaming above them, and the station lights bled red through the gaps in the metal. And Cade did not think about what he had just done to the mission or to himself. He thought about the extraction route. He thought about the weight limit on the escape pod. The maintenance levels were a maze. Cade had studied the station schematics for 6 days before the mission. He had them in his head the way he kept everything important. Not written down, not on a device that could be taken, just memorized and locked away somewhere behind his eyes. He moved through the dark corridors by that memory. Left at the coolant junction, down 2 levels at the service ladder, straight through the pipe room for 40 meters. The girls stayed behind him, always exactly the same distance, close enough to follow, far enough to run if she had to. She was smart. He respected it. The alarms had shifted pitch. They weren't general alarms anymore. They were search alarms, more specific, more directed. That meant the warlord's people knew what they were looking for and had a rough idea where to look. Cade adjusted the route in his head. The straight path was now the wrong path. He turned down a side corridor without slowing. He heard her hesitate behind him. 1 extra step, half a beat off rhythm. Then she followed. The side corridor was narrower and darker. The lights here had been broken for a while. The casings were cracked and the floor under them was stained from old electrical burns. Cade moved through the dark by feel and memory. His shoulder found the left wall and stayed there. He heard the girl's breathing get shorter. Not panicked, controlled, but shorter. He slowed his pace by a third. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. But the pace stayed slower, and her breathing evened out. They moved like that for several minutes. The collapsed section found them before he found it on his mental map. One moment there was floor, the next moment there was a hole, a wide gap where the metal grating had given way, dropping into machinery somewhere below. The gap was 3 meters across at least. The only way over was a support beam running along the left side, knee-width at best, with nothing on either side but the dark and the drop. Cade stopped. He looked at the beam. He looked at the gap. He looked back at the girl. She had stopped 2 steps behind him. She was looking at the beam too. In the low light, her skin did that flickering thing again. Not bright, just a pulse, like a heartbeat trying to find its rhythm. He went first. That was the obvious move. Test the beam, show her it held. He stepped up onto it and walked across without stopping, without slowing. The beam held fine. He got to the other side and turned around. She was still on the other side. She was standing exactly where he had left her, looking at the beam. Her arms were at her sides. Her skin was doing the flicker thing, steadier now, like something trying and not quite getting there. He understood, looking at her, that this was not about the beam. She had been grabbed every time a door opened for 3 years. She had been moved from one place to another by people who made the choices for her. She had learned that her own feet, going where someone else pointed, was just another kind of cage. The beam was narrow. Narrow meant she would need help. Help meant hands. Hands were a thing she had learned to be afraid of. He could have gestured, could have held out a hand, pointed, made encouraging movements with his arms. All the things you do to hurry someone up when time is not available and the search teams are getting closer, and every second on this station is a bad second to be standing still. He sat down, cross-legged, on his side of the gap, with the beam between them and the drop below and the search team somewhere above. He sat down on the floor and he waited. He rested his hands on his knees where she could see them. He looked at nothing in particular. He made himself the least threatening shape a man his size can make. She stared at him. He could feel the stare. He didn't meet it. Somewhere distant, through the metal and the dark, he could hear the pulse of station systems running the search grid. Her feet moved. She stepped onto the beam alone, because she chose to. And she walked across alone, and when she reached his side she was shaking. Not from the crossing, he could tell, but from something larger and older that had cracked at an unexpected edge. The kind of shaking that doesn't have a single cause. The kind that builds up over years and then finds one small quiet moment to come loose. He stood up. He didn't comment on the shaking. He reached into his vest, pulled out a ration bar, hard, tasteless, the kind that keeps soldiers moving when nothing else will, and held it out to her. She looked at it. She took it. She ate it in 4 bites. She had been trained by hunger to eat fast. He was already moving again, back toward the route. She fell in behind him, still shaking faintly, still holding the wrapper in her hand, like she wasn't sure yet if she was allowed to let it go. They reached the outer hull 40 minutes later. The escape pod bay was small and functional. 1 pod, emergency rated for 2, which was technically sufficient and practically a problem. Emergency rated for 2 meant 2 people of standard Keth body weight, which was not Cade's body weight, and not Cade's body weight plus kit. He did the math standing in front of the pod. He opened his kit. The rifle went first. Long-range weapon, useless in a pod, dead weight. He set it against the wall. Then the secondary ammunition, then 2 of the 3 armor plates from his vest, then the breaching tools, then the backup power cells. He kept the med kit. He kept the drive with the data. He kept his knife and his sidearm, and enough ammunition to matter. He kept going through the kit until the numbers worked. The girl watched him. He could feel that too. That same careful attention she had given him since the cell door opened. She was mapping him, he understood, building a picture of what kind of thing he was. He opened the pod door and stepped back. She looked at the pod. She looked at him. She looked at the pile of equipment he had left behind. Her skin did the thing it did, that deep, slow pulse. Something changed in it. Not the candle and wind flicker. Something steadier. Something that stayed. He would never learn the name of that color. He pointed at the pod. She climbed in. He climbed in after, and the door sealed, and the pod disengaged from the hull with a lurch that threw them both sideways, and then they were out. Away from the station, away from the alarms, and the search teams, and the warlord's yellow-lit trophy hall, spinning slowly into the open dark of space. The pod's navigation locked onto the nearest beacon and began to calculate the long route home. Cade counted his remaining ammunition. He checked the hull seals. He ran the power consumption numbers in his head and found them bad but workable. The girl sat across from him, still holding the ration bar wrapper, watching his hands. He kept them where she could see. The first day was mostly silence. That was fine with Cade. Silence was something he was good at. He had gotten very good at it over the past 2 years. In the way people get good at things, they practice every day without meaning to. The pod had a small display panel on the wall that showed their position, their heading, and their estimated arrival time. 3 days. Cade looked at that number and began calculating everything that could go wrong in 3 days on a pod this size with systems this old. The list was long. He started at the top. The girl, he had found her name in his mission files, cross-referenced with the Vari throne treaty documents. Sail Vari, a royal name, though he had not fully understood what that meant until he looked more carefully at the file. Not just royal, the queen's only daughter, missing for 3 years. Entire military campaigns launched around the gap her absence had made in the known galaxy. He had known none of that when he opened the cell door. He was not sure it would have changed anything if he had. Sail sat on the far side of the pod and watched him work. She was very good at being still. He noticed she put her back against the wall when she wasn't moving. Always the wall, always facing the room. She ate the second ration bar he gave her slowly this time, like she was reminding herself that the food was not going anywhere. He pretended not to notice that either. It felt like the right thing to do. By the second morning, the heating element failed. It went quietly, the way cheap systems fail. Not a bang, just a gradual drop in temperature that he caught early because he had been checking. He took the panel off the element housing and looked at the problem, which was straightforward. He did not have a replacement relay. He had a med kit, a knife, a sidearm, a data drive, and a thermal blanket. He gave her the blanket. He did not discuss it. He took it from the emergency pack, held it out, waited for her to take it. She hesitated, 3 full seconds, then took it and wrapped it around herself and watched him sit down against the warm side of the engine housing, where the heat from the drive core came through the wall. He had slept in worse places. He closed his eyes. He heard her move. Small sounds, the rustle of the blanket, her feet on the floor. He did not open his eyes. Something settled against his left side, warm. The edge of the thermal blanket came over his shoulder, awkwardly, not quite covering him. He opened his eyes. She was sitting beside him, with her back against the same wall, the blanket stretched between them. She looked at the display panel and the slow movement of their position across the star map. He looked at the star map too. "Thank you," he said. She did not respond. Either she had no translator, or the word didn't carry well, or she simply chose not to. But the blanket stayed where it was. He closed his eyes again. They sat like that until the engine housing cooled. On the second afternoon, she asked him something. It came out in her own language, a sound like water moving over smooth stone. He looked at her. She tried again, simpler. Then she gave up on words and used her hands instead. She pointed at him. then at the space behind them, the direction they had come from. Then she made a shape with her hands that he took, after a moment, to mean the cell. Why? Why did you come back for me? Not to perform thinking. He actually sat with the question for a real moment. The job changed, he said. She looked at him the way people look at a sentence they can't fully translate, but can still somehow feel the shape of. Then she looked back at the star map. He fell asleep sitting up, which he had learned to do in the field, and when he woke, the pod had been flying for 2.5 days, and Sail was asleep on his left, with her head tipped against the wall, and her skin doing that slow, steady glow, brighter now than when he had found her, like something that had started warming from the inside. Then the Keth patrol found them. The proximity alarm was a single tone. Low, polite, deeply unwelcome. Cade was on his feet, and at the display before it finished sounding. He read the sweep pattern, the distance, the timing. They had about 4 minutes before the patrol's standard scan would hit the pod and get a hard return. He looked at what he had. A pod with no weapons, a failing power system, 2 people and a handful of tools. He pulled the panel off the communication relay and looked at what was inside. He found 2 wires that were not supposed to be connected to anything. He connected them to each other and rerouted the pod's emission signature through a feedback loop that was technically impossible and practically reckless, and might, if the math worked, make them look like debris rather than a vessel. The math worked. The patrols swept past. Cade replaced the panel. He sat back down against the engine housing. He noticed his hands were steady, which they always were when things were bad. They got steadier as things got worse. He had always been built that way. He had learned to be useful because of it. He had also learned, somewhere along the way, that being useful was a good reason to keep going when you couldn't think of a personal one. Sail was awake. She had watched the whole thing from her side of the wall, with the blanket wrapped around her, and her skin pulsing fast. That candle and wind flicker, the one that meant something was frightening her. When the patrol moved away, the flicker slowed. When he sat back down, it slowed further. She said his name, or the version of his name she had built for herself. Cade Vell. Yeah, he said, like it was nothing. He went back to checking the hull seals. That night, or the shift that passed for night in the pod, he sat up when he thought she was sleeping, and ran the power numbers one more time, and found that they were going to be fine, close but fine. And he let out a long breath, and talked to himself the way he did when he was alone, very quietly, just to keep the silence from getting too heavy. He talked about nothing, the hull seals, the math, the arrival time, just words for the shape of them. He did not know she was listening. He did not know she would remember every word. The Vari interceptors found them on the 3rd day, which was better than the alternative. The communication system crackled, and a voice came through, formal, careful, official, and Cade gave his name, his rank, the situation in plain terms. There was a pause. Same register, but the edges were different. The kind of edges a formal voice gets when something enormous is happening behind it, and only a very small amount of it is being allowed through. Is she well? He looked at Sail. She was asleep, properly asleep, not the shallow, watchful sleep she had done the first 2 days. Her skin was glowing steadily. She still had half the thermal blanket. Yeah, he said. She's good. She's real good. He adjusted his left glove. The interceptors flanked them for the last hour of the journey. When the pod docked, the airlock opened to a corridor full of Vari crew, more people than the corridor needed, all of them there for the same reason. They surrounded Sail immediately, speaking too fast for him to follow. Hands moving, lights moving, everything moving. She went with them. Then she stopped. She turned back and looked at him across the corridor, over the heads of the crew surrounding her. She said something. His translator caught the sound and gave him nothing. The word was too layered, too specific to her language for the chip to map. He nodded anyway. She let herself be moved. He stood in the empty airlock and found out 3 days later, from a court diplomat with kind eyes, what the word had meant. He didn't believe it. The diplomat told him again, patient, certain. He looked at his hands for a while after that. He still didn't believe it, but it sat in his chest, warm in the place where things lived that he didn't know what to do with. The Vari homeworld was the most beautiful place Cade had ever been. He did not say this out loud, because he could not have said why it hit him the way it did. And he had long since learned not to speak about things he could not explain. But the beauty of it reached him anyway, past the walls he had spent 2 years building, and settled somewhere quiet. The cities were grown more than built. Towers of pale stone wrapped in living things, plants with wide silver leaves, flowers that opened in slow spirals and glowed faintly at their centers. The light here was soft and gold, filtered through an atmosphere slightly thicker than Earth's, so that everything looked touched at its edges. The streets moved with Vari people, who were taller than humans on average, with those luminous skins and long, careful hands, and who moved through their world with a grace that was not performed, just habitual. Everything was beautiful, and everything was quietly sad, in the way places get when something important has been wrong for too long. He saw it in small things. A memorial wall near the landing pad, covered in offerings, small lights, fabric strips, objects he didn't recognize. He could not read the Vari script, but he understood what memorial walls were for. He had spent enough time near them. The offerings were not old. Some of them had been placed that morning. 3 years of looking, and not finding, and still leaving offerings. That was a particular kind of endurance Cade recognized. Not hope, exactly. Something past hope. Something that keeps moving when hope has nothing left to say. The diplomat assigned to him was young and earnest, and introduced himself as Raylan. He was clearly nervous, which he was trying to hide by being extremely thorough. He explained the schedule, the protocol, the correct way to address court officials. He used a lot of words. He nodded in the right places. He kept his hands visible and his face calm. Raylan paused at one point and looked at him seriously. "You must understand," he said, "what this means, what you have done for our people." "I brought her home," Cade said. Raylan stared at him. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then made a small sound that Cade could not interpret. Like something had been too large to answer, and so he had answered nothing instead. They walked through the public halls of the court building. Cade looked. He was a man who paid attention to where he was, always, not just tactically, though that too, but simply because the world had things in it, and he was still, despite everything, a man who noticed them. The halls were full of light, but the people in them were moving carefully, the way people move when they have been in a state of suspended grief for so long that normal movement feels unsafe, like something that could break if they got careless. Staff spoke in lower voices than the space required. Officials passed each other in the corridors, with glances that carried whole conversations. The court was a place that had been running on duty and discipline for 3 years, while the center of it was hollow. They passed an open doorway, and Cade looked in without thinking. It was a large room. Maps on every wall. Star maps, route maps, corridor maps of hostile stations. Red lines and markings, and dead ends. The maps were so covered in notes that the original star patterns were barely visible. On the central table were stacked documents, comm logs, reports. A chair pushed back from the table, like someone had just stood up. Someone had been using this room for 3 years. Someone had sat in that chair and drawn those red lines and followed those routes and hit those dead ends, one after another, and come back and drawn more lines. He understood who. Raylan reached back and gently pulled the door closed. He did not comment. Cade did not comment. They kept walking. Sale arrived before the formal ceremony. She came through a side door in the reception hall, surrounded by healers and attendants, and she was dressed in clothes that fit her rank, formal and pale and finely made. She looked like herself, and also like a version of herself that had been taken apart and carefully put back together, which Cade supposed was accurate. She walked with her head up. That was hers. The healers hadn't given her that. She'd held on to it, through 3 years of someone trying to take it. She found him almost immediately. He was standing near the far wall, which was where he defaulted, back to something solid, facing the room. She crossed toward him through the reception hall. The attendants adjusted course without being told, the way they did around someone of her position. She stopped in front of him. They looked at each other. He had seen her eat a ration bar in 4 bites. He had carried everything non-essential out of his kit and left it on the floor of a hostile station. He had sat cross-legged in a dark corridor during an active alarm and waited because she wasn't ready. He had shared a thermal blanket and talked to himself in the dark, so the silence would not get too heavy. She had given him half the blanket. She had learned the sound of him over 3 days, and decided, based on nothing but that, to trust it. They had known each other less than a week. It felt, somehow, like longer. "Cadeville," she said. "Yeah," he said. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, low and brief, and her skin did the color without a name. Then Raylan appeared at his elbow and said the queen was coming, and the ceremony would begin. And Sale was drawn away by her attendants, and Cade moved back to the wall. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. The queen entered alone. Varaseln was 200 years old, in a body that looked nothing like 200 years. She was tall and still, and her skin carried the deep luminosity of her people at its full strength, not dimmed by grief, because grief had not been allowed to show, and had been pressed instead into the straightness of her back, and the steadiness of her gaze, and the way her hands hung at her sides with total stillness. She moved through the room, and the room changed around her passage, not because of ceremony, because of what she was, something that had been carrying a weight so long it had become structural. You could feel it without being able to name it. It moved through the air ahead of her. She looked at her daughter from across the hall. Cade watched her face. He had seen the room full of maps. He had heard the voice on the interceptor comm, wearing its official tone over something much more fragile. He had seen the offering wall with the fresh flowers. He knew what the look on her face was. He had no name for it in the context of a queen, in a court, in 200 years of formal rule. But he had seen it in doorways, in field hospitals, in the faces of people standing at the edge of news they were not yet sure they were allowed to believe. The last possible moment before certainty arrived. The moment where you stood very still, because moving toward the thing you wanted felt like it might break the world if the world turned out to have other plans. The queen stood very still. Then she walked forward. She passed the court officials. She passed the diplomatic assembly. She passed Cade, 1 step away from him, close enough that he could have reached out a hand, and she stopped. 1 step past him. She turned. She looked at him. Her eyes were a color between silver and blue that Cade had no earthly comparison for. They were old eyes in the way oceans are old, full of motion beneath a still surface. They looked at him with a directness that was not aggressive, but also was not gentle. It was the look of someone taking a true account. She said something, short, certain. His translator caught nothing. She moved on, toward her daughter, toward the reunion that had 3 years of weight behind it, and was now, finally, here. He stood in the reception hall and looked at the space where she had been standing. "What did she say?" he asked Raylan, who had materialized at his elbow again. The diplomat was quiet for a moment. "She said, 'I see you.'" He paused. "For our people it does not translate simply. It is not a greeting. It is not a formality. When a Vari says this, when the Queen says this, it is a testimony. It means you are real to me. You are known." Cade looked at the floor. He adjusted his left glove. "Okay," he said. He did not say anything else, because he did not have anything else that he trusted himself to say. He watched the Queen reach her daughter. He watched Sailvari's skin blaze. Not the candle flicker, not the dim ember pulse, but a full and total light, the kind of glow that happens when something that had been held back for a very long time is finally allowed to be what it is. The court made a sound, a single collective sound. Not a word, just breath. All of them, at once, finally letting it go. Cade stood against the wall and watched, and felt something moving in his chest that he did not examine too closely. He had learned, over the past 2 years, that some things were safer left in the dark. He would find out later that he had been wrong about that. Tomorrow would teach him. The formal ceremony was the next morning. Cade was given a dress uniform by court staff. It was human-made, which meant they had prepared for him specifically, which meant someone had thought about this ahead of time. He put it on in his assigned room and looked at himself in the reflective panel on the wall and decided the uniform looked like it belonged to someone with a future, and left it at that. The ceremony hall was the largest room he had been in on the homeworld. The ceiling was high enough that the upper portion disappeared into soft light. The walls were carved stone, covered in the long, flowing Vari script, histories, he supposed, or laws, or the names of the dead. There were hundreds of people present, diplomatic delegations, court officials in formal wear, Vari military in their ceremonial armor, which was layered and pale, and caught the light like water. Cade stood where they placed him, near the front, to one side. He was the only human in the room. He had been the only human in many rooms. He was comfortable with it. The Queen entered last. The hall went silent before she reached the doors, the quiet moving ahead of her like a wave. She took her place at the head of the room, on the raised platform, in front of everything. Her skin was at its full, luminous depth today. She looked like something carved from the same stone as the walls, immovable, old, enormous in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. The ceremony began. There were speeches. There were formal readings from the court record. There was music, briefly, Vari instruments that Cade could not name, producing sounds that were somewhere between strings and wind, and something he had no category for. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache slightly, which he noted and did not investigate. Raylan was at his shoulder, translating in a low voice. The words were mostly diplomatic, acknowledgments, alliance language, the formal fabric that governments sew between themselves when something has shifted and needs to be formalized. And then the Queen spoke directly. He knew it was different before Raylan began translating. The register of her voice changed. She had been speaking in the measured, formal tone of a ruler addressing a court. What she spoke now was the same language and entirely different. Something underneath the formality had moved, like the surface of water when something large passes under it. Raylan translated. His voice was quieter than it had been. "She is telling the court," he said, "what Sail told her. What happened. Not in political terms. She is not speaking about the mission. She is speaking about—" He stopped. "Keep going," Cade said. Raylan steadied himself. "She is telling them about the beam. She is telling them that her daughter was not ready to cross, and that you sat down in the middle of a chase because you chose to wait for her, that you did not hurry her, that you did not touch her. The hall was very quiet. She is telling them about the ration bar, about the weight limit on the pod, and what you left behind to make the numbers work. She is saying the specific things you left, the weapons, the armor. Cade looked at the floor in front of him. She is telling them about the thermal blanket, about where you slept. She is, Raylan's voice caught slightly. He steadied it again. She is telling them that you talked to yourself at night so that her daughter could learn the sound of you, so that your presence in the dark would become familiar before it had to be trusted. The hall had gone beyond quiet. It had become the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses gently on the chest. She is telling them what you said to her people on the interceptor, that her daughter was real good. Cade adjusted his left glove. He stopped adjusting it. He made himself stand still with his hands at his sides. The Queen continued. Raylan translated, and his voice was barely above a breath now. She says that her daughter told her one more thing. She says that Sale told her you never asked her name, that you did not look for it in the files or ask the interceptors. You were on the pod with her for 3 days, and you never asked. She says her daughter believes you did not ask because you did not want her to feel like information. The silence in the room had become enormous. Something was happening to the Queen's face. Cade had been watching it because he was a man who watched faces. It was how he survived, how he read rooms, how he navigated the world. He had been watching the Queen's face since she began to speak, and he had seen it change, slowly, the way stone changes when water moves through it over a long time. And then, at a certain point, faster. The Queen stepped down from the platform. The sound this produced from the court was the sound of 400 people adjusting simultaneously. A shift, a breath, the rustle of formal wear. Because this was not done. In the recorded history of the Vari throne, spanning centuries of formal ceremony, the sovereign did not step off the platform during official proceedings. She walked through the hall. The people parted, not from protocol, from something instinctive, the way a crowd parts when it understands that what is moving through it is larger than ceremony. She stopped in front of Cade. She was taller than him. Her silver blue eyes looked down at him with that same directness as the night before. But something had opened in them. Something vast and old that had been held closed for 3 years by duty and necessity and the simple requirement of continuing to rule a civilization that needed a queen and not a mother falling apart. She said something. One sentence. Raylan said in a voice that was barely sound. She says, I have been looking for her for 3 years, and I found her in the hands of a man who did not know her name and left his weapons on the floor of an enemy station to make room for her. The tears fell. Not gently, not the way tears fall in ceremony, one at a time, with grace and containment. They fell the way a wall comes down, all at once, without warning, without the dignity of being able to stop. Her face did not crumple. She simply stood in front of him, and the tears came and came and came, and 3 years of a hollow center poured through the surface of 200 years of composure. And she opened her arms. Sergeant Elias Cade, who had not let anything hold him since the Cedral Station collapse, who had been making himself smaller and more expendable for 2 years in the quiet hope that eventually there would be nothing costly left to lose, stood in front of a queen who was weeping and understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once like cold water, that he had been wrong. He stepped forward. The Queen of the Vari throne held a human soldier in the hall of her ancestors and wept. And her court wept with her, all 400 of them, without shame and without sound. Just that same collective breath from the night before, except this time it did not stop. It kept going. 3 years of held breath finally released all at once into a room full of carved names of the dead. And soft golden light. Sale Vari watched from across the room. She had positioned herself there on purpose. She had told her mother exactly what to say and exactly where to stand, and she had known, with the certainty of someone who had spent 3 days learning the sound of a man in the dark, what he would do. Her skin was the color that has no translation. The color that means something for which the Vari language, with its 4,000 years of accumulated vocabulary, does not have a word. She was 14 years old, and she had just changed a man's life on purpose. She was smug about it. She had earned it. After the offering, Raelen found Cade in the garden outside the hall, sitting on a low stone wall, with his jacket open and his hands resting on his knees. The diplomat sat down beside him with the careful respect of someone who understood that certain moments need to be approached slowly. "The Queen wishes to offer you something," Raelen said. "A formal place, a permanent one. This is not a title. It is older than title. It is called by the same word your sail uses for you. Cade Vel." Cade looked at his hands. "When the court scholars looked at the old root of that word," Raelen continued quietly, "they found a second meaning, archaic. It has not been used in this sense for many generations." He paused. "One who carries the dead home." The garden was still. A bird, or something like a bird, moved through the silver-leafed trees. "She offers you a home in return," Raelen said. Cade looked up. Across the garden, through the archway back into the hall, Sail was leaning against the doorframe, watching him. She had the patient expression of someone who already knew what was going to happen, and had decided in advance to enjoy it. He looked back at his hands. "The job's done," he said. Raelen began to translate toward the doorway, where a court official was waiting. A hand rose and stopped him. The Queen was standing in the garden. He had not heard her approach. She was alone. No attendants, no officials, just herself, in the gold light, with her eyes still carrying what the ceremony had opened in them. "I understood," she said. Her basic was careful, accented, new. Learned, he would discover later, in the weeks since the interceptor call, in the private hours before dawn, with a language program, because she had decided she would not need a translator for this moment. "The job is done. You are still here." He looked at her for a long time. He thought about the files he used to leave unopened. The kit he kept reducing. The way he had been making himself smaller and smaller and smaller, until there was a girl in a box and the math changed.